8 words. That's the entire foundation under the most notorious execution in the medieval North. 8 words of Old Norse, packed into a metre so tight the poet had to fold his sentence in on itself just to make it fit. Oke elubak atlet, hinsat, ivar ara, jorvik, skorit. A court poet named Sigvatar Thordarson composed that line somewhere around 1020, maybe as late as 1038, inside a praise poem for King Knut, and the standard modern translation runs like this. And Ivar, who resided at York, had Aella's back cut with an eagle. That's the whole of it, the seed. No screaming king pinned face down in the mud of a captured city. One compressed, ambiguous clause about a back and an eagle and a cutting, recited aloud in a warm hall to men drinking around a fire, more than 150 years after the event it claims to describe. Everything else, the sword point set against the spine, the ribs cracked away from the backbone one at a time, the lungs hauled out through the wound and arranged across a man's shoulders until they resemble a pair of folded wings. All of that grows out of those 8 words over the following 3 centuries, the way a pearl grows around a piece of grit. And by the time the medieval writers were finished with it, the blood eagle had become the most feared image the entire Viking age ever produced. People who cannot name a single Viking king can describe this execution in detail. So today I want to walk through the whole of it with you. The victims the old texts name, and they are kings and princes, every last one of them. The revenge stories that supposedly demanded something this extreme. And what a team of anatomists concluded in 2022 when they sat down with modern medical knowledge and asked, in complete seriousness, whether a human being could survive this procedure, for how long, and what the person holding the blade would have had to do, muscle by muscle, to pull it off. Fair warning. Their answer is worse than what you're expecting, just not in the way you're expecting. Before any knives come out, a quick hello. Welcome in, whether this is your first time here or your 50th. Get comfortable, pour something, this is a long one. And do me one small favor while you're settling in. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. City, country, the middle of a night shift, wherever. I love scrolling through those. A massive thank you, as always, to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members, the people quietly funding the absurd number of research hours that go into an episode like this one. You keep this channel breathing. If you'd like to join them, the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. All right. Back to the 9th century, and to the man whose death supposedly set this whole horror in motion. His name was Ragnar, and according to the stories, he died at the bottom of a pit full of snakes. Ragnar Lothbrok sits in a strange place in the record, half in history and half out of it, and the sagas that tell his story were written down in Iceland during the 1200s, 3 or 4 centuries after he would have lived. His byname means hairy breeches or shaggy trousers, and the sagas even bother to explain it. A pair of tar-boiled, fur-covered leggings he wore to protect himself while killing a giant serpent as a young man, a detail I mention mostly so you understand what sort of literature we're dealing with. Serpents follow this man around his entire legend, from his first great deed to his last breath, and the medieval authors clearly enjoyed the symmetry. In the stories, he becomes a Danish king, a raider of tremendous reputation, husband to several remarkable women, and father to a group of sons whose names anchor him to actual documented events. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, Uber, Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye. That last one named for the mark in his iris, a pale ring like a serpent biting its own tail. Whether one real man stood behind the character, or whether the sagas fused 2 or 3 9th-century warlords into a single convenient father figure, the sources honestly won't settle for us, and I'm comfortable leaving that door open. What matters for tonight is what the legend says happened to him, and what his sons are said to have done about it. The legend goes like this. Late in life, Ragnar decided to raid England with only 2 ships. His advisors thought this was madness. His wife Aslaug thought it was madness, and knitted him a shirt she said no blade could pierce, and Ragnar sailed anyway, apparently determined that his sons, whose fame was beginning to eclipse his own, would never be able to say they'd outdone him. A storm wrecked both ships on the Northumbrian coast. Ragnar waded ashore with whatever men survived the surf and began burning his way inland, an aging king with soaked boots and no fleet behind him, and the Northumbrians came out in force under their king, a man named Aella. The fight went the way you'd think a fight between one shipwrecked crew and a kingdom's levies would go. The sagas insist Ragnar carved through wave after wave of them before he was finally taken alive, still wearing that shirt, and hauled in front of Aella, who demanded to know who he was. Ragnar refused to answer. Silence from a man whose name supposedly made the whole North Sea flinch. And Aella, unable to confirm what he suspected, and perhaps unwilling to believe his luck, ordered the prisoner thrown into a pit of venomous snakes, reasoning that a nobody would die quickly, and a somebody would say something first. The snakes wouldn't touch him. Hour after hour they slid across his arms and refused to bite. And eventually someone worked out the business with the enchanted shirt, and Aella had it stripped off him. Then the pit did its work. And here the legend gives Ragnar his death song, verses he supposedly composed while the fangs were going into him, calm, boastful stanzas about a life of slaughter, and one line above all the others that every later writer kept. The line the whole revenge story turns on. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. The little pigs were his sons. The grunting was what would happen to England when they found out. As last words go, medieval literature offers nothing colder. The old man is dying at the bottom of a hole, poisoned, alone, stripped of his armor and his dignity, and the thought he chooses to die on is a promise about other people's suffering. Aella heard the line reported back to him and, in the saga's telling, felt the first touch of genuine fear. A threat delivered by a dying man in verse is a threat someone took time over. The Middle Ages loved that deathbed performance so much it eventually got a spin-off. A separate poem survives, the Krakumal, 29 stanzas presented as the full text of what Ragnar sang among the snakes, composed in the 12th century, a complete career retrospective delivered mid-envenomation, raid by raid, with the venom as accompaniment. It closes with the old king announcing that the spirits of death have come to fetch him home, and that he will die laughing. Later translators, wanting the scene even wilder, famously mangled one of its kennings into Vikings drinking from the skulls of their enemies, and handed the world its most durable fake Norse fact. The line describes ordinary drinking horns. The skull version is the one everybody knows. This story attracts that sort of thing. The news travelled to Denmark, and the saga stages the son's reactions with a level of physical detail that tells you exactly what its audience wanted from a scene like this. The messengers arrive while the brothers are at their ordinary occupations, and the storyteller moves down the line of them one by one, watching their hands. Bjorn Ironside was holding a spear shaft, and he gripped it so hard while listening that the print of his fingers stayed pressed into the wood afterward. Hvitserk was playing a board game, and he squeezed the playing piece in his fist until blood ran out from under his fingernails. Sigurd, snake in the eye, was trimming his nails with a knife when the messengers spoke, and he kept trimming straight down into the bone and gave no sign he'd noticed. And Ivar the Boneless, the one the saga treats as the most intelligent and by far the most dangerous, changed colour while he questioned the messengers, his face going red, then ashen, then swollen with the effort of containing whatever was moving through him. And he asked precise, careful questions about exactly how his father had died, every detail of the pit, and made no threats at all. The brothers began shouting about immediate vengeance. Ivar said no, not yet, not like this. Aella would be expecting rage, and Ivar declined to bring him any. One thing about that scene hangs over everything that follows. The saga audience, 13th century Icelanders sitting through a winter, understood those bleeding fingernails and that knife going into the bone as a promise. Injury to the family demanded repayment, publicly, proportionally, and the more shameful the original death, the more spectacular the repayment had to be. A king of Ragnar's stature dying in a hole, killed by animals, denied a weapon in his hand, was about the worst death that legend could hand a Norse warrior. Whatever answered it would need to be something no one had seen before. Hold that thought while the fleet gathers. From the legend, the story now crosses into ground that actual 9th century documents stand on, and the two versions of events run alongside each other for a while, close enough to touch. In the autumn of 865, a Viking force, unlike anything England had faced before, came ashore in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by the people on the receiving end, calls it the Michael Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army, and the name alone tells you the monks reaching for it had run out of ordinary vocabulary. Earlier raids had been seasonal. Ships appear, a monastery burns, the ships go home before winter. This force didn't go home. It wintered in England, demanded horses from the East Anglians as the price of peace, got them, and mounted itself into something that could move across country faster than news of it could. At its head, the sources place men named Ivar and Ubba, and later a Halfdan, and English writers of the next generation had no doubt about the connection, describing Ivar, or Hinguar as they spelled him, as the crudest of the Danish chieftains, a man who tortured Christians for pleasure. Whether this Ivar was truly the son of a man who died in a Northumbrian snake pit, no English source says. The English had never heard of Ragnar. What they recorded was the army, its size, and the direction it turned in the year 866, when the horses' heads swung north toward Northumbria. The timing was not an accident, and even the sober English chronicles admit it. Northumbria in 866 was busy tearing itself apart. The reigning king, Osbert, had been pushed off his throne by a challenger named Aella, and the two of them were locked in a civil war over the wreckage. Later English tradition adds that Aella had no royal blood at all, a usurper, a tyrant, which may be true or may be the Polish that gets applied to a loser after the fact. Either way, the kingdom's fighting men were watching each other rather than the coast, and on the first day of November, 866, the great heathen army walked into York, All Saints' Day, a major feast when much of the city's leadership would have been gathered at the cathedral rather than standing on the walls. The old Roman defences were in disrepair, the garrison was thin, and the richest city in the north of England, a trading town of workshops and wharves, and a minster full of treasure, changed hands in a day. The army settled in behind the Roman stonework and waited to see what the Northumbrians would do about it. What the Northumbrians did took them almost 5 months, and you can feel the desperation in it. Osbert and Aella, two men actively at war with each other, sat down together and made peace. Whichever of them ended up ruling Northumbria, there would be no Northumbria to rule unless York came back. They merged their armies. They gathered, the chronicle says, an immense force. And on the 21st of March 867, they attacked their own capital city. The first phase went well, better than it had any right to. The English broke through the outer defences, some of them forcing the crumbling stretches of wall, and got inside the town. Then the fighting funneled into streets. A Viking army that had been living in that maze for 5 months, that knew every yard of it, turned on attackers who were now compressed into lanes where numbers meant nothing. And the chronicle's phrasing for what followed is quietly horrible. An immense slaughter was made of the Northumbrians, some inside, some outside, and the survivors made peace with the heathen. Peace, in practice, meant a puppet. The army set up an Englishman named Ecgbert to hold Northumbria on their behalf, collect its rents and keep its farmers farming while the real power stayed behind York's walls. And the tidiness of that arrangement shows how far past simple raiding this force had moved, an occupying government now, thinking in revenue and years. Both kings died there. Osbert fell in the battle, and Aella, on the same day, ended his life in York. The city Sigvarta's poem would one day attach him to forever. Now, on that death, the sources split, and this split runs down the center of everything else I'm going to tell you tonight. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written within living memory of the event by Aella's own countrymen, people with every reason to catalogue heathen atrocity in loving detail, says only that both kings were slain on the spot. A battlefield death, nothing more. Simeon of Durham, drawing on northern records, gives the date and the place and the grief, and likewise no execution. The Norse tradition, written down 300 and 400 years later by descendants and admirers of the winning side, says Aella did not die in the fighting at all. It says he was taken alive. And it says the sons of Ragnar, presiding over their captured city with their father's death song still ringing in their ears, decided that a quick end was more mercy than the man who owned the snake pit had coming. The fullest surviving version of what they supposedly did to him sits in a text called The Tale of Ragnar's Sons, put on parchment around the year 1300. And it spends one sentence on the whole procedure, a sentence I'll give you nearly whole, every word of it earning its place. They caused the eagle to be carved on the back of Aella, and they cut away all of the ribs from the spine with a sword in such a way that his lungs were pulled out there. That's the sentence 4 centuries of horror grew from. Sit with the staging of it for a moment, the way the saga audience would have. A king of Northumbria, a man who days earlier commanded armies, stripped and forced down onto his face in the middle of his own capital, in front of whatever remained of his own people, held flat while a blade opens his back along the spine. The carving first, the outline of a bird cut through the skin, deep, deliberate, unhurried, each stroke of it survivable, each stroke of it worse for being survivable. Then the sword going in beside the backbone, then the ribs, one after another, cracked outward and away. Then hands going into the open chest of a living man, or a man who had been living moments before, and drawing the lungs out into the daylight to lie against the splayed ribs. From above, and the whole point of the display is the view from above. The ruined back resembles a bird with its wings thrown open, an eagle made of a king. Other texts tell it differently, and the differences map almost perfectly onto when each author was writing. Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish churchman working around the year 1200, a full century before the tale of Ragnar's sons, was assembling his Gesta Danorum in those years, 16 books of Danish glory put together in the circle of Archbishop Absalon to hand Denmark a past as grand as Rome's, and a scene of Danish princes dismantling an English king suited the project nicely. He describes the sons ordering the figure of an eagle cut into Aella's back, just the figure, the outline of the bird incised into the skin as deeply as a blade could manage, and then, in the detail Saxo adds, salting the wounds. No ribs in his version. No lungs, a man skinned into the shape of a bird and then salted, left in torment on the ground where his kingdom had died. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, meanwhile, has the eagle carved into the back and then reddened, the wound lines filled and painted with the king's own blood, an image somewhere between execution and craftsmanship. And beneath all of these, oldest of all, those 8 cramped words of Sigvartas, composed within a couple of lifetimes of men who could have stood in York that March. Ivar had Aella's back cut with an eagle. Each generation of writers inherits the line and hands it on heavier. The 11th century gives us a back, an eagle, a cutting. The 12th adds salt, the 13th reddens the carving. By 1300 the ribs are off the spine and the lungs are in the open air. You can watch the death grow decade by decade, like a story being retold around a long series of fires, each teller certain the last one left something out. What you make of that growth is genuinely up to you, and I mean that. One way to hold it. Later authors embroidered a plain old verse until an atrocity condensed out of the embroidery. Another way, the full horror was always there, carried in memory and in performance, and the early poet compressed it into 8 words, precisely because every listener in the hall already knew what cutting an eagle on a man's back involved, the same way I can say firing squad to you and skip the diagram. Both of those are live possibilities. Scholars have gone to war over them, and we'll get to that war properly a little later, I promise. But before the argument comes, the procedure itself. In 2022, a group of researchers stopped asking whether the blood eagle happened and asked a far more unsettling question instead. Could it? Take the fullest, worst version the sagas describe, hand a 9th century executioner 9th century tools, and ask what actually happens to the human body, minute by minute. Their answer runs to 39 pages, and it is one of the most quietly disturbing documents ever printed in an academic journal. The study appeared in January of 2022 in Speculum, the Journal of the Medieval Academy of America, under the title An Anatomy of the Blood Eagle, and the team behind it tells you everything about the approach. Luke John Murphy, a scholar of pre-Christian religion at the University of Iceland, joined up with 3 anatomical scientists from Keele University's medical school, Heidi Fuller, Peter Willan and Monty Gates, people who spend their working lives on the structure of the human body. Together, they went through all 9 medieval accounts, laid the described procedure out step by step, and then tested each step against everything modern medicine knows about the back, the chest, blood loss, and breathing, not to prove the executions happened. On that question, they stayed carefully agnostic all the way through. They wanted to know whether the thing the sagas describe is physically achievable by one person with Viking-age equipment, and what the victim's body would be doing at each stage. So walk it with me, stage by stage, and I'll flag where the medieval texts and the modern anatomy shake hands, and where they part company. This next stretch is not for the faint of heart, but then you clicked on a video with this title, so I suspect you knew that. Start with the position. Every source that bothers to specify agrees on it. The victim is face down, prone, arms presumably stretched out or pinned, on the ground or across some raised surface, held by hands or ropes, or the simple absence of anywhere to go. A conscious adult man in mortal terror does not lie still, so figure multiple men on the limbs, a knee in the small of the back, the face pressed into earth. He can hear everything behind him and see none of it. That detail alone would have done half the executioner's work. Every sensation arrives without warning, from a direction the human body is least able to defend, along the one surface of ourselves we can never watch. Now the back itself, and here the anatomists get specific in a way the sagas never do. The ribs, the target of the whole exercise, do not sit anywhere near the surface. They lie buried under an armor of muscle that evolution built precisely to be strong, and an executioner has to get through all of it before a single rib is even visible. The first cut, the team concluded, would run from the base of the skull straight down the midline, along the spine, all the way to the loins, exactly the span the sagas describe. That opening stroke goes through skin and fat and then meets the trapezius, the big kite-shaped muscle you feel when you shrug, thick, fibrous, heavily supplied with blood. Under it, the levator scapula and the rhomboids, the muscles mooring the shoulder blades to the spine, and those matter. The shoulder blades themselves physically overlie the upper ribs. Sever those moorings, and each scapula comes loose enough to be shoved aside, off the rib cage, out of the working area, like moving furniture. Further down waits the latissimus dorsi, the broad sheet across the lower back, and the study makes the almost offhand observation that once cut along the midline, the latissimus can be peeled and folded outward to either side in flaps, and that surgeons do something comparable today in certain reconstructive operations. The same motion, they note, would have started shaping the display. Two wide wings of the king's own flesh laid open to left and right. Beneath everything, packed in two long ropes down either side of the spine, the erector spinae, the deep muscles that hold a human being upright, and those have to be carved away from the vertebrae and ribs section by section before bone finally shows. Think about the labor in that for a second, and about the time. None of these cuts kills. Of everything in this stage, that detail matters most. The blood vessels in the muscles of the back bleed freely, ferociously even, but they are not the great vessels, and a strong man open to the bone across his whole back is a man in unimaginable agony, who is still entirely alive, still conscious, still able to feel the flaps of his own musculature being folded off his ribs, and, at this stage, still able to scream. The sagas skip this part. The sagas go from carving straight to ribs in the space of a comma. The anatomy says minutes passed in that comma, and the men holding the limbs would have felt every one of them through their hands. The tool question turns out to have its own grim comedy, and the team spends real time on it. The sagas say sword, nearly all of them, and the anatomists say a sword is close to the worst possible choice for this stage of the work. A Viking age sword is a slashing and stabbing weapon, double-edged, most of a meter long, superb for opening a man in battle, and hopeless for the controlled, close, layer-by-layer butchery this stage demands, like trying to peel an apple with a scythe. What the work actually calls for, they concluded, is a long, rigid, single-edged knife, held nearly flat, parallel to the muscle, drawn in long, controlled strokes. And Viking Age Scandinavia had exactly that knife, in nearly every household and on nearly every belt. The sax, the sayax, the sturdy single-edged blade that everyone from farmers to kings carried for daily work. The study's comparison stopped me cold the first time I came across it. A large sax held that way, they write, would function much like the big knives used in autopsies today. A pathologist's knife, essentially, doing a pathologist's job on a subject who was not yet a corpse. So the scene the anatomy demands differs from the one the sagas paint. The famous sword may have come out later, for the bone. The opening act belongs to something humbler, an everyday blade, the tool a man used on wood and rope and dinner, moving with terrible patience through the architecture of another man's back. And all through this stage, the audience. I keep having to put them back into the frame. The sagas take them for granted, and we tend to forget them. In every account this happens in front of people. The victorious army at minimum, and at York, if you follow the Norse version. the surviving population of the city, Aella's own subjects, compelled or choosing to watch their king processed like livestock. The study is blunt about the sensory reality of the scene. Blood, skin, and removed tissue distributed across the immediate area. The practitioners themselves soaked in gore and screaming, they note, likely audible over a significant distance. That last phrase has a footnote dry quality that makes it worse. Over a significant distance, past the walls, in other words, out across the river, into whatever remained of the town, where people who could not see the event could follow it perfectly by ear, and could hear the exact moment coming shortly when the screaming stopped. On, then, to the ribs, and to the stage where the anatomy turns pitiless. The medieval texts describe the ribs being cut from the spine, hogva in the Old Norse, hewn, and here the modern team ran into the first hard mechanical problem. The joint where each rib meets its vertebra is a genuine joint, wrapped and bound in some of the strongest short ligaments in the human body, engineered to survive a lifetime of impacts and coughing fits and falls. You do not slice through those quickly. Cutting each one free individually, they judged, would take longer per rib than any executioner with a struggling subject and a watching army was likely to spend. The realistic method is blunter. You break them. A heavy blade swung with force, and here the saga's sword finally earns its casting, brought down along the line where rib meets spine, fracturing them, one strike after another, 12 on each side, working down the length of a man's back. Each blow lands with the deep percussive crack of green bone. Each blow also drives the broken ends of the rib inward before they can be levered out. And each blow, the anatomists point out, does something far more decisive than break bone, and it happens on the very first stroke. Running along the inside of the rib cage, tucked under the lower edge of every rib, travels an intercostal artery. And these are not minor plumbing. They branch directly off the aorta, the body's main line, and they run under precisely the stretch of bone the executioner is now shattering. Fracture the ribs at the spine, and you tear those arteries open in the same motion, pair after pair, and the bleeding that follows is of a different order from anything the muscle work produced. Arterial bleeding, under full pressure, into the opened back and the chest cavity at once. The study walks through the numbers with clinical patience. An adult man carries roughly 5 liters of blood. Confusion sets in when he's lost around a third of it. Somewhere past 40%, consciousness starts to slide. And at half, around 2.5 liters, he dies. With multiple intercostal arteries torn at once, those thresholds arrive not in minutes but in moments, and even that undersells what the first strokes near the spine would do. The aorta itself, that main line, descends along the front left face of the thoracic vertebrae, directly beneath a blade driven in at the backbone. The anatomists judged it very likely that the aorta would simply be cut early, in which case blood pressure collapses at once and the brain begins shutting down within heartbeats. Their phrasing is about as plain as scientists ever allow themselves. Death, they concluded, would have arrived within a matter of seconds, not minutes, and it would have begun from the moment a blade was first thrust into the chest cavity at the spine to start on the ribs. Seconds. Everything the popular image of the blood eagle asks you to believe depends on stretching those seconds into a performance. And the bleeding, believe it or not, is only half the reason the performance is impossible. The other half is air. Your lungs do not hold themselves open. They stay inflated for one reason only, a sealed chest whose negative internal pressure keeps them stretched against the ribs, like a balloon pressed to the inside of a jar, and the instant that seal is broken, the balloon lets go. Open the back of the chest on both sides, as this procedure does by definition, and both lungs collapse completely and immediately, a double pneumothorax more total, the team observes, than almost anything modern trauma medicine encounters even in war, and war rarely removes the entire back wall of the chest. Each lung shrinks down to a dense, deflated mass roughly the size of a fist, and with the ribs shattered, the intercostal muscles cut, their nerves severed, and the diaphragm sliced from its moorings along the lower ribs, every mechanism the body owns for drawing breath is gone at once. The victim cannot inhale. He cannot exhale in any controlled way. And, in the detail I find hardest to shake, he cannot scream. Screaming needs moving air. From the first blow at the spine, whatever sound the crowd had been hearing stops, and the rest of the ritual unfolds over a body that has been rendered silent, the lips perhaps still moving against the dirt, the eyes perhaps still open for a few last seconds, while an oxygen-starved brain, burning through its reserves at panic rates, closes down. The study allows those final conscious moments to be even briefer than the numbers suggest. Terror and struggle spend oxygen ferociously. A few seconds after the sword first enters, they estimate. After that, whatever else happens, happens to no one. So now the anatomists arrive at the famous image, the one on every book cover and in every screen depiction. The lungs pulled out and draped over the shoulders, quivering, some tellings insist, fluttering with the last breaths like the wing beats of a bird. And here modern medicine simply closes the door. A collapsed lung is a fist-sized lump of dense tissue. Nothing about it can flutter. Fluttering needs breath, and the capacity for breath ended with the chest wall. Worse, the lungs cannot travel. The bronchi and the great vessels tethering each lung to the windpipe and the heart are short, a few centimeters of slack at most, nowhere near enough to lift a lung up and out through the back and lay it across a shoulder. To externalize the lungs at all, you would have to cut them entirely free, severed from airway and heart alike, at which point what you are arranging on the splayed ribs are two compact masses of tissue that the study, in the most devastating aside in all 39 pages, describes as a less than spectacular display. All of that labor, all of that blood, and the wings of the eagle amount to two deflated lumps the size of clenched fists resting on a dead man's back. The soaring image lives in the later tellings and the modern retellings. The anatomy offers something smaller, uglier, and finished far sooner. The wings themselves, though, the ribs, those the anatomy permits, with one further round of violence. Fracturing the ribs at the spine frees them on one side only, to spread them outward into anything wing-like. Each rib needs breaking a second time, along the flanks, down the side of the body near what anatomists call the mid-axillary line, the seam running straight down from the armpit. 2 full fracture lines per side, the whole back of the rib cage converted into hinged panels, and then the panels folded outward and down. The study notes, almost gently, that this last motion requires no special tool or skill at all, only a good grip and ordinary strength. Hands, in other words. After all the blade work, the final shaping of the eagle is done by hand, gripping the broken edges of a man's rib cage and folding him open like the covers of a book. I've sat with a lot of execution methods on this channel. Very few sentences from the sources have stayed with me the way that one detail from the modern study has. One genuine puzzle stopped the team for a while, and their proposed solution drags a new object into the story. Breaking ribs downward with a heavy blade risks driving bone splinters into the very lungs the ritual means to extract and display, and hacking blindly into the chest also risks mincing them outright. If the display mattered, and every source insists the display was the entire point, the executioner needed a way to separate rib from spine quickly, without pulping what lay beneath. The only method the anatomists could conceive, and they are candid that this is speculation, is a hooked implement, something with a shallow barb that could be set over the top rib, snugged against the spine, and then hauled downward along the vertebral column in one long unzipping pull, tearing the ribs free in sequence from above rather than smashing through from behind. And Viking Age armories held a candidate: the barbed spearhead, the hunting and war spear with backward-facing lugs at the base of the blade, its long shaft offering exactly the leverage such a pull would need. No surviving tool is confirmed to have been used this way, they stress, and none may ever be. But they point to a carving that may be the only picture of a blood eagle made by anyone who could have seen one. On the island of Gotland stands a memorial called the Stora Hammer's One Stone, raised in the 8th or 9th century, its face crowded with small scenes in relief. In one panel, a figure lies belly down. Above him, another figure grips a spear near its head, point angled at the prone man's back, while a bird hovers to one side and armed men stand watching. That is the whole scene. No caption, no runes to explain it. 12 centuries of weather softening the edges. It might show a sacrifice to Odin. It might show a blood eagle in progress, spear set to spine. It might show something else its carver's neighbors understood at a glance, and we never will. The stone keeps its own counsel, and given everything we've just walked through, part of me is glad it does. Put the whole reconstruction together then, and the 2022 conclusion lands like this. Yes, one person with common Viking Age tools could physically perform everything the fullest sagas describe: the flaying open of the back, the freeing of the ribs, the spreading of the wings, the extraction of the lungs, all of it. And no, almost none of it could have been experienced by the victim. He lives through the carving, every endless minute of it, and dies within seconds of the first blow at the spine, deaf to the rest. The elaborate eagle, the unfolded ribs, the arranged lungs, all of that is work performed on a corpse, or on a man crossing into being one. Sculpture rather than torture for 9/10 of its duration. The blood eagle the anatomists hand back to us is a strange double object, briefer and less cruel than the legend in one direction, and in another direction worse. The men doing it kept working, carefully, artistically even, long after their victim was past caring, for the benefit of an audience alone. The whole performance aimed past the man on the ground, at everyone standing around him. Aella is the famous name on the victim list, but he isn't the best documented case. That grim honor belongs to a prince of Norway, killed on a small island at the top of Scotland, and his story comes with the fullest surrounding cast of any Blood Eagle account we have, a family feud so vicious that the execution almost feels like it's natural weather. So travel north with me now, a generation past York, to the Orkney Islands around the year 893, and to an earl with one eye. His name was Einar, and history remembers him as Torf-Einarr, Torf-Einarr, the man who supposedly taught the treeless Orkneys to cut and burn peat for fuel. A homely little claim to fame for a man about to do what he does in this story. The sagas introduce him almost cruelly. He was a son of Ragnar, the powerful Earl of Moor in western Norway and close companion of King Harald Fairhair, but a son by a slave woman, and his father never let him forget any part of that. Ugly, the saga says flatly, and blind in one eye, though it adds, in one of those lines that carries a whole childhood inside it, that he was nonetheless the most keen-sighted of men. When the earldom of Orkney fell vacant and turned lawless, Ragnar handed it to this least valued son as you'd hand someone a broken tool, telling him to go and be gone. And Einar's reported answer to his father cuts to the bone even at 1,000 years' distance. He promised to go and said the greatest favor he could do the household was to depart and never return, as nothing at home suggested he'd amount to anything anyway. One ship, his entire inheritance as the saga counts it. He sailed it west, killed the pirates squatting in the islands, and made himself Earl of Orkney with nobody's help at all. Meanwhile, back in Norway, the family he'd left behind was about to be destroyed, and by princes. Harald Fairhair, the king who unified Norway, had a surplus of ambitious sons and not enough kingdom to divide among them, and two of these, Halfdan Halfdan Longleg, and his brother Gudrod the Gleaming, decided to carve out standing for themselves the direct way. They gathered men, marched on men their father favoured, and one spring night they came to the hall of old Earl Rognvald, Einar's father, Harald's dearest friend. They surrounded the house and they burned it, with Rognvald and 60 of his men inside. Death by burning in a hall at night, with no chance to reach a weapon, was among the most despised killings the Norse world knew, and the sagas dwell on the treachery more than the flames. 61 men cooked inside their own timbers to feed the ambitions of two princes. King Harald's response tells you how far over the line his sons had gone. He raised an army against his own child, crushed Gudrod, and stripped him of everything. But Halfdan Longleg had already gone west over the sea with 3 warships to take for himself the earldom of the dead man's son. He fell on Orkney without warning, and Einar, caught unprepared, fled across the water to Caithness on the Scottish mainland, and watched a prince of Norway sit down in his seat. He didn't stay away long. Within the year, Einar came back with ships and men, met Halfdan's fleet, and broke it in a sea fight that ran into the evening. Halfdan himself went overboard into the darkness and made it ashore on Northumbrian, the flattest, most remote scrap of the Orkneys, a low green shelf of an island where a man has almost nowhere to hide. At first light, Einar's men landed and began walking the island to hunt the survivors, and the saga gives us one of its eeriest small moments here. Scanning the distance, Einar said he could see something moving on the island, sometimes rising up, sometimes lying down, something that was either a man or a bird, and they should go to it. It was Halfdan Longleg, trying to keep low in a landscape with no cover, rising to move, dropping when eyes turned his way. A prince of Norway, burner of halls, crawling in the grass of the smallest island he could reach. They took him alive. What follows is the account the entire scholarly fight has circled ever since, and the Orkney saga tells it close to word for word. Einar caused an eagle to be carved on Halfdan's back with a sword, all the ribs cut away from the backbone, and the lungs drawn out through the opening, and he gave him to Odin for the victory he had won. Every element in one sentence, the carving, the ribs, the lungs, and, unique among all 9 accounts, the explicit dedication of the dying man as a sacrifice to a god. Everything the anatomists reconstructed for us happened here, if it happened anywhere, on the turf of Northumbrian, with the sea noise on every side. The carving of the outline through the living man's back while his father's killer, while the son of his victim's friend, watched. The long minutes of the knife work with Halfdan conscious under it. Then the sword to the spine, the cracking of the ribs down both sides. The sudden silence as both lungs fell in. The opening out. The fist-sized lungs set on the spread ribs, and a man who 2 days earlier commanded warships now arranged on the grass in the shape of a bird, offered upward to the god of victory like something set on a plate. Afterward, the saga says simply, they buried him there in a mound. Somewhere under the turf of that island, if the story holds, a prince of Norway lies folded open still, and Einar sang about it. This detail gets left out of most retellings, and I think it changes the entire flavor of the scene, so you're getting it. Torf-Einarr was a skald, a gifted poet, whose verses were remembered and written down, and several of the stanzas attributed to him concern this exact killing. In one he taunts his brothers by name, noting that no spear had flown from their hands while he did the avenging of their father, the quarter share of vengeance that fell to him, he says, he has paid in full. In another, he stands on his new trophy in plain words, declaring himself glad, telling his listeners that ewe's wool was easy to tear, or in some renderings crowing over what the eagle now scored with its claws, and inviting whoever objected to come and do something about it. Poetry composed by the man himself, about the man he'd just unfolded, possibly recited within sight of the mound. Whatever the blood eagle was, ritual or literary flourish, the culture around it prized this exact combination, the atrocity and the elegant stanza about the atrocity, delivered by the same mouth. The aftermath tells its own quiet story about how the Norse world priced these things. Killing a son of Harald Fairhair could not simply stand, whatever the provocation, and the king came west across the sea with a fleet to answer it. And yet what happened next was neither battle nor a second execution. Negotiation happened. Harald levied a fine on the islands, 60 gold marks, and the saga says Einar offered to pay the whole sum himself in exchange for the farmer's ancestral land rights, a deal with consequences Orkney lawyers were still arguing about centuries later. A father accepted money from the man who had carved his son into an eagle. The mound stayed where it was, and Torf-Einarr ruled Orkney for a long time afterward and died. The saga notes, without any apparent sense of irony, of sickness, in his bed, an old man. Of everyone in this entire video, the one person who indisputably, in every version, performs a blood eagle with his own hands, is also the one person who gets the peaceful death. His line prospered too. The Earls of Orkney for the next several centuries all counted descent from the one-eyed son of a slave that nobody at home had wanted. History hands out very few morals and the occasional punchline. 2 names down, and the list keeps going, though from here it bends away from history and into legend proper, and I'll be up front with you about that as we go. The third victim never existed at all outside of poetry, and his death sits inside the most famous story cycle the North ever produced. In the legends of the Volsungs, the young hero Sigurd, the dragon slayer himself before the dragon, goes to war to avenge his murdered father Sigmund against the king who killed him, a man named Lyngvi, son of Hunding. Sigurd wins the battle and takes Lyngvi alive, and at his elbow throughout stands his foster father Regin, the smith, quiet and sharpening. In the Eddic poem Regin Smal, preserved in a 13th century manuscript but built of older verse, the smith speaks a single gloating stanza over what happens next, and the old translations render it along these lines. Now the blood eagle is carved on the back of Sigmund's killer with a bitter blade. Nothing further. The poem trusts its audience to know the rest, and after the last 20 minutes with the anatomists, so do we. What I'd have you notice is who this death is for. In the legendary material, the blood eagle isn't handed out to thieves or cowards or random captives. It marks the settling of the deepest debt the culture recognized, a father's blood, and it appears at the exact narrative moment when the son squares that account. Aella supposedly killed Ragnar. Ragnar's sons answer. Halfdan burned Rognvald. Rognvald's son answers. Lyngvi killed Sigmund. Sigmund's son answers. 3 different stories, written by different hands in different centuries, and the same shape underneath every time. Whoever was inventing or remembering this rite, they were consistent about what it was for. Lyngvi's death, oddly enough, gets told twice, and the second telling comes wrapped in one of the strangest frame stories in all of medieval literature, one that shows how these horrors actually travelled from mouth to mouth. A tale called Norna Guest's Thatter, preserved in the same giant 14th century manuscript we'll meet again later tonight, describes a mysterious old man arriving at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason, the fire and sword converter of Norway, around the year 1000. The stranger calls himself Nornagest, guest of the Norns, the Fates, and he carries a harp, and stories, and one small candle stub he guards with his life. Pressed by the king, he explains. At his birth, 3 fates spoke over his cradle, and the youngest, insulted, declared he would live only as long as the candle beside him burned. So the eldest snuffed it and handed it to his mother, and Nornagest has carried the unburned stub for 300 years. 3 centuries of wandering, and in that time, he tells the astonished court, he served Sigurd the Dragon Slayer personally, rode with him against the sons of Hunding, and watched with his own eyes as the blood eagle was carved into Lingvi's back with a sword. An eyewitness account of the rite, delivered at a royal court by a man claiming to be 300 years old. At the story's end, Olaf has him baptized, and Nornagest, newly Christian, lights the candle at last and lies down, and when the flame gutters out, so does he. The medieval Icelanders who wrote the blood eagle down knew perfectly well their information was old, second-hand, carried across impossible spans of time, and Nornagest is what that knowledge looks like turned into a character, the whole problem of transmission given a harp and a candle and sat down by the fire to talk. His account of Lingvi's eagle is exactly as trustworthy as he is, and the storytellers, to their credit, practically wink while saying so. The 4th name breaks the pattern in the strangest way. The 4th victim wasn't a king, or even, strictly speaking, a man. In a late Icelandic tale called Orm's Thatta Storolfssonar, the strongman Orm Storolfsson, a figure so exaggerated the stories have him carrying a ship's mast that 30 men couldn't lift, sails to a haunted island to face a monster called Brusi, a giant, a cave-dwelling horror with a mother who takes the shape of a monstrous black cat. Orm's reason for going is the death of his sworn brother Asbjorn, and the tale describes that death in a scene that out-horrors everything else in tonight's video, the blood eagle included, so brace yourself. Brusi had caught Asbjorn, overpowered him, and killed him by opening his belly, taking hold of his intestines, and winding them out of his living body around an iron pillar in the cave, turning him slowly, while Asbjorn, in the purest distillation of the Norse ideal you'll ever run across, composed and recited poetry until he died, verse after verse, a death song unspooling at the same rate as everything else. When Orm reaches the island and finally wrestles the giant down, pinning him after a fight the tale spends pages on, the vengeance he selects is precise. He draws his knife and carves the blood eagle on Brusi's back, cutting the ribs from the spine and drawing out the lungs. And, the text adds, Brusi loses his life with little patience, an Icelandic understatement I've thought about at odd hours ever since. Some versions add the salt here too, rubbed into the opened back, the same touch Saxo gave Aella. Even in a monster story, even with a giant on the receiving end, the logic stays identical. A sworn brother counts as family, an unspeakable death demands an answering one, and the answer has wings. Past those 4, the role of alleged victims dissolves into maybes, and the maybes involve a couple of very famous corpses. In 1974, a distinguished historian named Wallace Hadrill, delivering a lecture, aired the then unpublished argument of a colleague, Alfred Smith, that the Blood Eagle's victim list may have stretched beyond Aella and Halfdan to King Edmund of East Anglia, an Irish king of Munster named Mael-Gwalai, and, at the outer edge of possibility, Aelfheah, Archbishop of Canterbury. Edmund is the great what-if of the list. He was the young king of East Anglia when Ivar's army came back through in 869. He refused their terms, and the earliest detailed account, written about a century later, has him tied to a tree, whipped, shot with so many arrows that he bristled, the writer says, like a hedgehog, and finally beheaded. The head thrown into brambles and famously guarded by a wolf until his people found it. Smith's suggestion was that underneath that very Christian martyrdom narrative, with its echoes of Saint Sebastian, might sit a garbled memory of something Norse and ritual, the same army, the same commander, the same treatment its poets attached to Aella. Nothing in the sources says so outright, and plenty of scholars find the martyrdom account horror enough on its own. Mael-Gwalai of Munster died at Viking hands in the 850s according to Irish annals, with later tradition claiming his back was broken on a stone, and some have wondered whether that, too, distortedly recalls a back-centered rite. And Aelfheah, taken by a Viking army in 1012, was killed at a drunken feast, pelted with bones and the skulls of cattle, until an axeman ended it in what one account frames as mercy. Line the candidates up, and you can feel the list thinning as you squeeze it. Halfdan's case rests on the sagas alone. The Irish king rests on late tradition. Edmund and Aelfheah rest on suggestion. Keep squeezing, and, as one historian dryly observed, you're left holding a single name, Aella, and a single half-stanza of poetry. Those same 8 words we started the evening with. The whole vast edifice balances on a point, which does not make the edifice false, mind. Plenty of true things balance on a point, but you should know the shape of what you're standing on, and now you do. Having spent all this time on the victims, turn now to the man the tradition names as the first perpetrator. Ivar the Boneless is one of the strangest figures the 9th century produced, and everything about him deepens the mystery of what happened at York rather than settling it. The name first. Everyone always starts there. Hin ben Lausi, the Boneless, and no source explains it in a way that satisfies anybody. The saga tradition offers a curse story. Ivar conceived on a night his mother warned against. Born, the text says, with gristle where bone should have been, unable to walk, carried everywhere by his men on poles and shields, and yet possessed of the sharpest mind, and, some versions insist, arms strong, beyond any man's. Modern medical writers have looked at that description and floated osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, a real condition in which the skeleton forms soft and breaks endlessly, and a few have gone further and sketched the great strategist of the heathen army directing battles from a litter, a commander who conquered kingdoms and never once stood in one. Other readers suspect the name meant something ruder, a jibe about impotence, Ivar being the one brother who left no recorded children. Still others think it described the opposite of weakness, a fighter so flexible he seemed to have no bones at all, serpent-like, and given this family's snake obsession, from the father's death pit back to little Sigurd's eye, that suggestion has a certain family logic. Take your pick. The 9th century isn't telling. What the 9th century does tell us, through terse and hostile entries in English and Irish annals, is where Ivar went and what fell down when he arrived. After York, he took the heathen army through Mercia and back into East Anglia, where King Edmund died in 869, and English tradition never forgot who commanded there. Then he vanishes from the English record, and a man the Irish annals call Imar surfaces in the west, sharing power in Viking Dublin, and in 870 this Imar and his ally Olaf did something that stunned even a hardened age. They besieged Dumbarton Rock, the fortress capital of the Britons of Strathclyde, a stronghold on a volcanic crag that had never fallen to anyone, and after 4 months they took it, reportedly when the well ran dry. The two kings came back to Dublin the following year with 200 ships, and the annals say the ships rode low, loaded with plunder and with a great throng of captives, English and Britons and Picts, hauled to the Dublin slave markets. Look at those lines and the snake pit romance falls away for a moment. Whatever else the man was, he was a dealer in human beings on an industrial scale, and thousands of people whose names nobody wrote down ended their lives in chains because his ships had come. Then, in 873, the annals of Ulster record it flatly. Imar, king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, ended his life. No battle mentioned. The most feared commander of his generation seems to have died in bed, of something as unglamorous as disease, one more entry in this story's running theme of the worst men getting the quietest exits. His grave, though, might just possibly have been found, and it puts real bones on the table in a story that otherwise has none. That same year, 873, the great army wintered at Repton in Derbyshire, digging in around a royal Mercian church, and when archaeologists led by Martin and Berta Biddle excavated the site across the 1970s and 80s, they found the winter camps dead. One burial stood out, a grave the diggers numbered 511. A big man close to 6 feet, at least in his late 30s, laid out with a sword, a Thor's hammer amulet at his neck, and injuries that tell their own short, brutal story, wounds to the skull, and a massive cut into the top of the left thigh bone, a stroke that, given the angle, would very likely have taken away his genitals along with the artery. An end so mutilating that whoever buried him placed a boar's tusk between his legs, restoring in bone, perhaps, what the blade had taken, so he'd arrive in the next world whole. And nearby, under a low mound, a charnel chamber packed with the disarticulated remains of at least 264 people, most of them robust adult men of fighting age, stacked around one central burial that had been destroyed before scholars ever reached it. The Biddles suggested carefully that a monument like that, a mound of an army's dead arranged around one lost central figure, in the exact camp, in the exact year the annals close Imar's account, might be the resting place of Ivar the Boneless himself. It can't be confirmed and likely never will be. But if you want a single image to hold against all the poetry, hold that one. 264 sets of human bones packed in the dark around an empty centre, the physical remainder of the force that took York, arranged around a man who is missing. The Blood Eagle question, at bottom, is always this question. The bones are real, the violence that broke them is real, and the centre, the thing that would explain it all, is gone. One last Ivar detail before we widen out. The sagas couldn't resist giving even his corpse a job. Ragnar's saga claims Ivar chose to be buried in England, in a mound raised at the place most exposed to invasion, declaring that while his bones lay there, no enemy landing nearby would ever take the country. And the saga insists this worked, that later raiders who came ashore near the mound failed, one after the next, for 200 years, until William the Conqueror landed in 1066, went to the mound first, broke it open, found the body uncorrupted, burned it on a pyre, and only then, with the ashes cold, began the conquest of England. Pure legend, obviously, written by people flattering their own ancestor with the claim that it took the destruction of his corpse to make England conquerable. But notice what the legend assumes its audience will accept without blinking, that a body, correctly handled, correctly placed, correctly ruined, changes what happens among the living. The blood eagle runs on that exact assumption, and it's where we're headed next. Norse beliefs about dying are the ground all of this stands on, and almost nothing in that culture was as carefully sorted as death. Dying wasn't one event to these people. It came in ranks, in qualities, and the quality of your death followed you. At the top sat the death in battle, weapon in hand, facing forward, the death that made a man eligible for Odin's hall, for Valhalla, where the chosen slain feasted and fought until the end of the world needed them. Down at the bottom sat what the Norse called, with open contempt, the straw death, dying on the straw of your own bed, of age or sickness, the fate of thralls and the unlucky, and warriors dreaded it enough that stories tell of dying old men having themselves cut with a spear point at the last moment, marked for Odin, a technicality filed with the management, in the hope the god would squint and count them among the slain. Between those poles ran every other way to go, each with its price, and below the straw death, beneath the whole ladder, lay the deaths that carried shame, the ones later scholars, borrowing from anthropology, group under the term bad death. Killed by animals in a pit, denied any weapon, like Ragnar. Burned alive inside your own hall by night, trapped, unarmed, cooked with your household, like old Roggenwald. Gutted around an iron pillar in a cave, like poor Asbjorn. A bad death didn't stain the dead man alone. It stained his family, publicly, and it kept staining them, every day, for as long as the death stood unanswered, and every neighbor, rival and trading partner could watch the stain and draw conclusions about how safe it might be to push this family a little further. All the Blood Eagle stories are built on that pressure, and once you see it in every single account. The 2022 team laid this out as clearly as anyone ever has, so here it is in plain speech. In every version we have, the man commissioning the eagle has recently suffered exactly this, the bad death of a father or sworn brother at the victim's hands, and the eagle answers it. The shame had been public, so the answer had to be public too. The death being avenged had been extreme, so the answer went further, and it had to demonstrate slow, total control over the enemy's body, helplessness being the exact poison the family needed drawn out of its name. A quick beheading on a beach answers nothing. Anyone can get lucky with one stroke. But this, holding a royal captive down and spending the time, the labor, the craft, converting a king into a carved thing before an audience, while your poets take notes, This said what it needed to say in a language every Norse observer was fluent in. The account is settled. The family is dangerous. Look at what we do calmly. In the study's own crisp phrasing, this was no mere torture. It carried meaning, atrocity and press release in one body, and through it, for some of the sources at least, moved a god. The Orkney saga, remember, says Einar gave Halfdan to Odin for the victory he had won, and that little clause opens onto the darkest room in the whole Norse religious house. Odin took sacrifices, and medieval writers, some of them claiming eyewitness sources, describe what that meant. Adam of Bremen, a churchman writing in the 1070s, recorded what he'd been told of the great temple at Uppsala in Sweden, where every 9th year a festival was held at which 9 males of every kind of creature were offered, and their bodies hung together in the sacred grove beside the temple, dogs and horses and men suspended side by side in the trees, and his informant, he says, a Christian, had seen 72 carcasses hanging there at once. Notes added to Adam's manuscript fill in the grounds around that grove, and they don't lighten the picture. Beside the temple grew an enormous tree of a species nobody could identify, green in every season, summer and the dead of winter alike, and no one could say why. Near it lay a spring where a different offering was made. A living man was plunged under the surface, and the watchers waited. And if he never came back up, the people's wish was granted. A drowning as a form of question, with the god's answer measured in whether the water returned what it was given. The whole account reached Adam second-hand, and he was a hostile witness with every reason to paint the heathens black, worth remembering. But the sheer administrative texture of it, the 9-year cycle, the fixed number of victims, the specific festival calendar, has struck plenty of historians as too dull to be invented. Slander usually can't be bothered with scheduling. Hanging was Odin's signature. The god himself, called Hangatyr, god of the hanged, said to have hung 9 nights on the world tree, pierced by his own spear, a sacrifice of himself to himself, and his human offerings tended to follow the pattern, hanged or stabbed, or both, given breath by rope and blade rather than by fire or water. The spear especially marked a man as his. Throwing a spear over an enemy army dedicated the lot of them. Cutting a dying man with a spear point booked his passage. So when the anatomists, working from pure mechanics, arrived at a hooked spearhead as the likeliest tool for unzipping a rib cage, and then noticed the storer hammer's stone showing a spear held over a prone man beside what looks like a sacrificial scene, with a bird hovering above the whole tableau, you can understand why even careful scholars felt a small cold draught. The bird matters too. Eagles belong to Odin all through the mythology, perched over his hall, worn as his disguise, and in the poetry of battle, the eagle is one of the beasts that feed on the dead, so that giving your enemy to the eagle was already, in verse, a way of saying you'd killed him. Carve the god's bird into the god's gift, and the ritual explains itself, if ritual it was. One text says so, in 9 words. Snorri Sturluson, retelling the identical event a few years later, deleted the dedication entirely and never tells us why. Maybe his source lacked it. Maybe a 13th century Christian just didn't care to hand Odin the credit. The gap between those two tellings, 1 sentence wide, is exactly the size of everything we don't know about Norse religion. Whatever stood behind it, God or grief or both, the willingness to work meaning into a dead or dying body is one thing about this culture the ground itself confirms, and the single best example archaeology has produced comes from the great trading town of Birka in Sweden. Excavators there opened a grave, number 959 in their catalogue, and found a woman of standing, buried carefully, dressed richly, with fine brooches and beads, given every material sign of respect her community could afford. She had been beheaded, and her lower jaw was missing, and where it should have been, someone had placed the jawbone of a pig. Stay with that arrangement for a second. No written source explains it, and none ever will. A community that decapitated a well-dressed woman, then buried her with honor, then rebuilt her face with the bones of an animal. Punishment, fear of the walking dead, some ceremony we have no name for, all have been proposed. But the point for tonight is narrower. These were people demonstrably capable of combining lethal violence, deliberate mutilation, symbolic animal substitution, and high social respect in a single body, in a single hour's work, without any apparent sense of contradiction. A culture that buried her would not have found the blood eagle unthinkable. Whether it found it real, the ground so far declines to say, and I should be straight with you about the strength of that silence. Among all the thousands of Viking-age skeletons lifted and studied across a century and a half of archaeology, not one has been found with the ribs severed from the spine in the manner the sagas describe. Not one. That silence has real weight, and skeptics are entitled to lean on it. Then a person remembers how few of the dead were ever buried unburned, how selectively bone survives 11 centuries, and that a body opened out on a beach may never have been buried at all, but left to the actual eagles. And the silence stops settling anything, and just sits there, the way silences in this story tend to do. The last piece of the meaning, and to me the cruelest, is what the right would have taken from the victim beyond his life, and here everything we covered about good and bad deaths comes home. Every road to a good Norse death ran through dying well, upright if you could manage it, armed if you could manage it, and at the barest minimum, composed, facing what came, ideally with words. The literature is full of men grading each other's last moments. Ragnar sings in the snake pit and wins immortality by it. Asbjorn recites poetry while a giant reels his guts out of him, and the tale preserves his verses like relics. Composure at the end was the final exam of an entire way of life, and the blood eagle, look at its architecture, is an exam no one can pass. The victim is face down, denied even the dignity of watching death arrive. He is unarmed, pinned in the dirt. And from the first stroke at the spine, if the anatomists have it right, breath itself is confiscated, so that whatever courage lived in the man, whatever death song a king of Northumbria or a prince of Norway had been saving for the moment, it dies unspoken in a collapsed chest. And the record of his final performance, the thing his whole culture would judge him on forever, is silence, and the wet sounds of the work continuing. The right killed the man in seconds and killed his death, so to speak, along with him, and for the world these stories come from, I honestly can't tell you which loss its first audiences would have counted the greater. Now for the war over whether any of it happened, and I use the word war advisedly. Few topics in Norse studies have produced this much sustained academic combat over this few words of text. For most of modern history, nobody fought at all. 19th and early 20th century historians took the sagas more or less at their word, and the blood eagle settled comfortably into the scholarly furniture as a genuine heathen rite, described in standard reference works taught to students. One respected medievalist calling it a ferocious sacrificial ritual, and moving on without breaking stride. In 1977, Alfred Smith, in his study of the Scandinavian kingdoms of York and Dublin, gave that tradition its strongest modern statement. The details in the Orkney saga, he argued, are too anatomically particular to be a later storyteller's fancy. The sword set in at the spine, the ribs taken down to the loins, the lungs through the wound. Sacrifice for victory sat at the very center of Odin's cult, and the eagle over Halfdan and the eagle over Aella were the same institution, glimpsed twice. He even wondered whether Edmund's martyrdom account, with its bound king and its strange excess, held the earliest garbled trace of the rite in a Christian source. Smith's blood eagle was real, religious, and exactly as terrible as the sagas said. 7 years later, a scholar named Roberta Frank walked into that consensus and set off a charge under it. Her article ran in the English Historical Review in 1984, and its argument, once you hear it, is one of those ideas you can't unhear. Go back, she said, to the only Viking Age evidence in the whole file, Sighvatar's 8 words, and look at what skaldic poetry actually does. Court poetry of that era runs on a fixed store of images, and among the most worn of all is the one scholars call the beasts of battle, the eagle, the raven, and the wolf, who arrive after every battle in every poem to feed on the dead. Praising a warrior meant saying he fed the eagle, that ravens tore his enemies, that the wolf went satisfied from his battlefields. Hundreds of such lines survive, and no one takes any of them for records of trained attack ravens. Now set Sighvatar's claws in that company. Ivar caused Aella's back to be cut by an eagle. Grammatically, in the Old Norse, the eagle can be the tool of the cutting just as easily as the design being cut, and if it's the tool, the line stops describing a ritual and starts describing carrion, a boast in the standard idiom that Ivar killed Aella and left him face down for the birds, an eagle standing on the dead king's spine, scoring his back with beak and claw. On that construal, everything that came later flows from a misunderstanding. Generations of prose writers, further from the old poetry with every decade, taking a stock image of scavenging literally and then needing to explain how a man cuts an eagle on a back, inventing a procedure and then improving the procedure each time the story was passed along. Frank traced the improvements like a stratigrapher, the plain carving in the earliest prose, then the salt, then the reddening, then the ribs and lungs and the god, each version, in her tart phrase, more lurid, pagan, and time-consuming than the last, medieval horror inflation running for 2 centuries straight. She noted, as others had, that no English or Frankish writer of the Viking Age itself, men who itemized heathen outrages for a living, ever mentions any such practice. Strip away the misunderstood stanza, she concluded, and the right has nothing under it, a bird, as she put it elsewhere, that never would have been. The counterattack came fast, and it came, fittingly for this story, from Iceland. Bjarni Einarsson, a senior Icelandic philologist, published a reply within 2 years and another after that, and his case was as narrowly technical as Frank's, fought hand-to-hand over vocabulary and word order across those same 8 words. The verb in the stanza, he argued, and the arrangement of the clause sit far more naturally with the traditional sense, a design being incised, than with a bird doing the incising, and Icelandic audiences from the poem's own tradition never seem to have taken it any other way. Every medieval person we can watch encountering the line, including prose writers only a couple of centuries downstream and steeped in skaldic convention themselves, understood it as a carving on a back. If the carrion image was really the obvious first sense, he in effect asked, why did no one closer to the poetry than us take it that way? Frank answered. He answered back. The exchange ran on into 1990, and if you want a measure of how unresolved it remains, the standard modern scholarly edition of the stanza today prints the cautious translation, had Aella's back cut with an eagle, and then appends a note laying out both camps, declining, in the politest editorial voice imaginable, to pick a winner 4 decades into the fight. While the philologists dug in, other scholars took up positions across the whole field. Some historians of religion sided with the literary explanation and wrote the right out of their accounts of Norse paganism. Others pointed back at Uppsala's Hanging Grove, the spear cult, and the demonstrable appetite for ritualized killing, and argued that a culture verifiably capable of hanging 72 creatures in a grove has forfeited the benefit of the doubt. A middle party, and over the years it may have become the largest, holds that both things can be true at once. That Norse warriors really did, on occasion, mutilate the corpses of hated enemies in ways involving the back and the imagery of the eagle, and that the fully staged theatrical rite of the late sagas is nonetheless a literary construction layered over those plainer cruelties. And the defenders of authenticity hold one more card, the best in their hand. Skaldic verse is not ordinary hearsay. The meter is so strict, the alliteration and internal rhyme so binding, that a stanza resists casual rewording, the way a locked box resists browsing. Change a syllable, and the machinery seizes. Verses composed in the 10th and 11th centuries could and demonstrably did travel by memory, essentially intact, into the 13th century manuscripts. And that means Sigvartar's 8 words likely are, verbatim, what a poet at Knutscourt actually said, transmitted across 200 years with a fidelity approaching print. What the fidelity cannot do, and skeptics are just as right about this, is reach back through the further 150 years between Sigvartar and York. A perfectly preserved sentence from 1020 tells you with certainty what people believed about 867 in 1020. About 867 itself, it whispers. Then 2022 arrived, and, in a move I find quietly elegant, simply stepped around the whole battlefield. Murphy and his anatomist colleagues opened their study by noting that the authenticity fight had gone about as far as words could carry it and changed the question. Never mind, for now, whether it happened. Establish what would have happened if it had, and their findings hand ammunition to every camp at once, and I suspect they knew it. To the believers, the procedure is physically performable. No anatomical impossibility bars it. The tools existed, and the ritual logic, the bad death answered before witnesses, fits the culture like a key fits its lock. To the skeptics, the version everyone believes in, the living victim, the enduring, the fluttering wings, is flatly impossible. So at minimum, the popular blood eagle is a fiction, whatever the historical one was. And to the middle, a rite that kills in seconds and is mostly performed on a corpse sits far closer to corpse mutilation with symbolism than to prolonged torture anyway, dissolving some of the difference the two sides were fighting over. Where does that leave you and me? Exactly where I promised at the start we'd end up, with the evidence on the table and the conclusion left in your hands. A half stanza that is certainly ancient and certainly ambiguous. Prose accounts that are certainly late and certainly grew in the telling. A culture certainly capable of ritual killing, an archaeological record certainly empty so far, and an anatomical analysis certifying the whole thing possible while demolishing its most famous image. People I respect look at that table and see a preserved memory of real 9th century practice. Other people I respect look at the same table and see the most successful horror story of the Middle Ages. Both of them are looking carefully. You're allowed to keep both in your head at once. Historians do it all the time, whatever we claim at conferences. Which raises an obvious question. If the medieval sources are this thin and this tangled, where did the version in everyone's head come from? The crisp, confident, step-by-step blood eagle that shows up in documentaries and novels and 1,000 internet lists of history's worst punishments. For that, you can thank the Victorians, and their fingerprints are all over the corpse. The pivotal figure is an English historian named Sharon Turner, a solicitor turned scholar whose history of the Anglo-Saxons began appearing in 1799 and stayed in print for generations, shaping how the whole English-speaking world pictured this era. Turner took the scattered medieval fragments and fused them into a single continuous procedure, narrated with the confidence of an eyewitness. In his telling, the victim is stretched face down and restrained. The figure of an eagle is carved into his back. The ribs are then separated from the spine, one after another. The bones and skin are drawn outward until they stand out from the body like a pair of wings. And then, the touch Turner lifted from Saxo and made famous, salt is rubbed into the vast wound, a saline stimulant, in his marvelous clinical phrase, applied to keep the sufferer conscious and in maximum agony for as long as possible. Watch what happened in that last clause. The salt, in Saxo, comes across as degradation heaped on a dying man. In Turner, it acquires a purpose, a piece of torture engineering, deliberately prolonging life, and with that one interpretive shove, the blood eagle changed species. The medieval accounts describe something done to an enemy. Turner describes a system designed to maximize suffering over time, and it's Turner's version, not the sagas, that every modern depiction descends from. 35 years later, the German historian Lappenberg's History of Anglo-Saxon England quickly translated into English, repeated and consolidated the same composite, and by the middle of the 1800s, the fully assembled blood eagle, wings, salt, prolonged screaming and all, sat in respectable reference books as settled fact, footnoted in a circle, each author citing the last. The 19th century didn't just transmit the image, though. It wanted it, and the appetite tells you something about them. This was the great age of the Viking revival, when Northern Europe fell in love with its imagined pagan ancestors, dragon ships on biscuit tins, horned helmets invented whole for the opera stage, and the Victorians ran a double game with the Norsemen that the Blood Eagle served perfectly. On one hand, the Vikings were ancestors to be proud of, bold and sea-roving, everything an empire liked seeing in its own mirror. On the other, they were heathens, whom Christian civilization had absorbed and tamed, and every ounce of their barbarity flattered the civilization that ended it. A torture this Baroque let a Victorian author have both at once, the frisson of ancestral savagery and the warm glow of having outgrown it, and modern scholars who study this period of scholarship, including Murphy of the 2022 team, have observed bluntly that Victorian writers exaggerated the rite's role for exactly these reasons. The ritual as it lives in popular culture today, owing as much to their enthusiasms as to any saga. One more layer of telling, in other words, deposited on top of all the medieval ones and laid down by men in frock coats rather than men in mail. The blood eagle you grew up hearing about was assembled in a library in Georgian and Victorian England, out of parts manufactured in 13th century Iceland, from a blueprint 8 words long, drawn in 11th century Norway, describing an event perhaps in 9th century York. Provenance like that would sink an antique at auction. It only ever seems to strengthen a horror story. From the libraries it walked into the screens, and the last decade or so has put the blood eagle in front of more human beings than every previous century combined. The History Channel's series Vikings did the most to canonize it, staging the rite twice as the ultimate punishment in Ragnar's world. The first, in 2014, falls on Jarl Borg, a rival who had attacked Ragnar's home and family, and the show builds the sequence as high ceremony, torchlight, assembled witnesses, the Norwegian group Wardruna scoring it with throat-deep chant, and Borg, told what awaits him, concerned above all with one thing, that he endure it without crying out. In the show's theology, a victim who bears the eagle in silence proves himself worthy of Valhalla. He manages it, back opened, ribs out, dying uprightish and mute, and the scene plays as something close to dark sacrament, horror shading into a strange mutual respect. Later in the series, a fictionalized King Aella receives a far angrier version from Ragnar's sons, revenge without the sacrament, and the symmetry with the sagas closes. Notice, though, everything the show quietly chose. The victim survives deep into the procedure. He could scream, and refrains, made meaningful by a choice the anatomists tell us no chest opened that way can offer. Television needs a performance, and a performance needs a conscious victim. And so, 7 centuries after the saga writers and 2 after the Victorians, the 21st century added its own layer to the telling, exactly on schedule. The video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla, released in 2020, went somewhere even the show hadn't. It's Ivar the Boneless, midway through the English campaign, performs the Blood Eagle on a captured Welsh king, Rhodri, and the game frames the choice through the player's companion character, who can object or walk away, while a vision of Odin looks on approvingly and names the act that of a true Norseman. Millions of players, many of them meeting the term Blood Eagle for the first time in their lives, watched the ribs come out in rendered detail and absorbed the Odinic, sacrificial version of the debate as simple fact, Smith's side of a 40-year scholarly argument settled by a cutscene. Ari Aster's folk horror film Midsummer, the year before, tucked the image into its Swedish commune of smiling pagans. Late in the film, a missing character is found in a shed, propped face down, back opened, ribs splayed, lungs set out across them, eyes replaced with flowers, and the camera holds on it just long enough for you to recognize the shape, the director trusting, correctly, that enough of the audience now knows the eagle on sight to need no explanation. The image turns up in the game Hellblade among the horrors of its Norse hellscape, on a card in The Witcher's Gwent, and across the whole genre of Viking-flavoured metal, most directly in the Swedish band Amon Amarth's song Blood Eagle from 2013, a track that narrates the procedure in the first person to the victim and, you will be entirely unsurprised to hear, features skin peeled, ribs cracked, and lungs spread as living wings, the full Victorian model roaring along at concert volume to festival crowds of tens of thousands. Every one of these, the show, the game, the film, the song, chooses the physiologically impossible version, the conscious victim, the breathing wings. Nobody stages the one the anatomists describe, the seconds of noise and then the long, quiet craft work on a body. And when you think about why, the answer is uncomfortable in an instructive way. The impossible version is a story about the victim, his agony and his soul, and stories about people are watchable. The possible version is a story about the audience, about what the killers wanted everyone standing there to understand, and that version implicates the watcher, you, me, the festival crowd, everyone who clicked on a video called Worst Punishment in the History of Mankind. The saga's first listeners at least had the excuse that the message was aimed at them. We sought it out. Before the Blood Eagle faces its competition, the sons of Ragnar have their own endings to collect, and, fittingly, those endings come with a bird. The sons of Ragnar did not enjoy their vengeance quietly. Halfdan Ragnarsson took armies north and south, became the first Viking ruler to formally share out Northumbrian land among his soldiers, plough land handed to spearmen, and died violently in Ireland in 877, fighting over Dublin, the kingdom his brother had built. Sigurd, Snake in the Eye, and Bjorn Ironside dissolve back into legend, claimed as royal ancestors by the dynasties of Denmark and Sweden respectively. Nothing decorates a family tree like a son of Ragnar. Ivar we've dealt with, dead in his bed in 873, possibly presiding still over 264 skeletons in a Derbyshire churchyard. Ubba lasted longest in England's nightmares. In 878 he landed in Devon and was brought to battle at a place the chronicles call Sinwit, and the English broke his force at dawn and killed him, and with him they captured the thing the sources dwell on far longer than his death, the banner called Raven. West Saxon tradition within a couple of generations swore this flag had been woven by the daughters of Ragnar, Ubba's own sisters, in a single afternoon, and that it was no ordinary cloth. Before a battle the army would win, the raven in its weave fluttered as though alive. Before a defeat, it hung dead. On the morning of Sinwit, presumably, it hung very still. Take the story for whatever you judge it worth. What interests me is the pattern it completes. This family enters English history with a bird supposedly carved into a king's back, and exits it with a bird woven by its daughters, captured on a Devon hillside, and in between, every poet who praised them reached for eagles and ravens feeding on their enemies. Whether the eagle on Aella's back was ever anything more than one of those poetic birds landing just once with its full weight is the whole question of tonight. And I like that the family's own story refuses to stop supplying wings either way. Now, the title of this video makes a claim: worst punishment in the history of mankind, and you're owed an honest reckoning of the competition. Humanity has been horrifyingly inventive in this department, and the Blood Eagle's claim to the crown is stranger than it first appears. Consider the strongest rivals one at a time. From ancient Persia comes Scaphism, the punishment of the boats, and our source for it is Plutarch, writing about the aftermath of the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC, where a young soldier named Mithridates wounded the rebel prince Cyrus, then drunkenly boasted of the kill that the Persian king wanted credited to his own hand. For that indiscretion, at a dinner party of all places, Mithridates was condemned to the boats. Two hulls fastened together, face and hands and feet protruding. The victim force-fed milk and honey until his bowels ran, more smeared over his face and eyes. The whole assembly floated on a stagnant pond in the sun, and the insects came, flies to the surface of him, and, as the days passed, worse than flies to the parts of him. The mixture and his own filth had begun to rot, while his heart still beat, creatures breeding and feeding in a living body kept alive by daily force-feeding precisely so the process could continue. Plutarch says Mithridates lasted 17 days. 17. The Blood Eagle's entire span, from first cut to last breath, fits into the opening minutes of one of those days. From imperial China comes Lingqi, the slow slicing, death by 1,000 cuts, on the books for roughly 1,000 years, reserved for the crimes the empire found most unforgivable, treason and the murder of parents, and practiced until, astonishingly, the spring of 1905. The condemned was bound to a post in a public place, and the executioner worked through a prescribed sequence of cuts, flesh removed from the chest, the arms, the thighs, piece following piece. The sentence graded by the number of slices before a final stroke to the heart or the neck. Some accounts say families could bribe the executioner to kill early and let the remaining cuts fall on a corpse. and some say the condemned were dosed with opium beforehand, small mercies orbiting a large horror. The final documented case, a man named Fu Zhuli, executed in Beijing in April of 1905 for killing his master, a Mongol prince, was photographed by French soldiers as it happened, and those photographs exist, circulating for a century since in books and, God help us, online, the only one of tonight's punishments you can, though I'd urge you not to, actually see. Weeks later, the empire abolished the practice. Against Ling Qi's deliberate prolongation, its bureaucratic sequencing of agony, the blood eagle's seconds of suffering barely register as an appetizer. Europe's own entries run the same direction. The breaking wheel, the great terror of the medieval and early modern continent, bound the condemned spread-eagled, there's a word, over a cartwheel or on the ground, and the executioner walked the length of him with an iron bar, shattering the long bones of the arms and legs at prescribed points, sometimes dozens of blows, before the pulped limbs were threaded through the spokes, braided into the wheel, and the wheel hoisted on a pole for the crows, where the broken man might live for hours, or, in cases the records preserve, with a shudder for days, begging passers-by. Merciful judges ordered the first blows delivered to the chest or neck. Unmerciful ones specified the opposite, bottom up, and wrote it in the sentence. The wheel outlived the Middle Ages by centuries. The last man broken on it in Europe died in Prussia in the summer of 1841, within the lifetime of people who saw photography invented. The languages that lived with the wheel still carry the bruise. Dutch speakers dragging themselves home after a brutal day will say they feel geradbracht, broken on the wheel, 4 centuries after the last Dutch executioner put the phrase into practice. And England, Aella's own island, developed its answer for traitors, hanging, drawing and quartering, formalized in the 1200s and lasting on the statute books into the 1800s. The condemned dragged to the scaffold behind a horse, hanged by the neck but cut down alive, castrated, opened, his bowels drawn out and burned in a brazier in front of his still working eyes, the heart out last, then the head off and the body cut into 4 parts, boiled, tarred, and distributed to the gates and bridges of the realm, where the pieces stood watch for years. William Wallace received the full sequence in 1305, and the point of the display clause, spelled out in sentence after sentence, was that the traitor's parts would preach at the city gates long after his death to everyone passing beneath. Set the blood eagle in that lineup, and something becomes clear that I'd wager cuts against every expectation you carried into this video. Judged by the measure most of these competitors were engineered around, duration of suffering, the blood eagle, if the anatomists have it right, finishes dead last. 17 days in the boats, hours or days on the wheel. A carefully sequenced eternity under the slicing knives, long minutes at the disemboweling table with your own bowels in the fire. Against all that, the eagle offers the agony of the carving, terrible and real but survivable, and then seconds, mere seconds, from the first blow at the spine to the closing dark. As torture, it barely competes. And yet no one lies awake picturing the boats, and everyone remembers the eagle, and the reason lives in the other measure, the one the English traitor's sentence gropes toward with its heads on gates. Every punishment in this lineup wants to speak to the crowd. The blood eagle speaks almost exclusively to the crowd. It spends seconds on the dying and then labors, patiently, artfully, for as long as the shaping takes, on the audience alone, converting a king into an image, and the image it makes works less as law than as signature. A family's mark, cut in a man. Worst is a measure of suffering, and by that measure the title probably belongs in a Persian pond. But if the measure is what a punishment reveals about the people applying it, the distance between seconds of death and hours of careful, meaningful, unnecessary craft on the body afterward, I understand completely why 1,000 years of listeners have kept handing the eagle the crown. 1,000-year run at the top of the nightmare charts doesn't happen by accident, and the mechanics of why this particular horror stuck are half the story of what it even is. The name alone does half the work. Blood eagle. 2 words, one of them an animal, and you already know things about it before anyone explains a single step, much as the Iron Maiden, very possibly a later invention itself, colonized minds on the strength of a name alone. A catalogue of torments with procedural titles fades into each other. The one named like a creature gets remembered like a creature. Then the shape of the act itself. Underneath the gore, this is a transformation story, the oldest and stickiest genre humans own. Every mythology on earth tells of people turned into animals, and the eagle takes that ancient story and performs it with a knife, a man entering the ritual as a king and departing it as a bird, wings and all, metamorphosis as murder. The mind files it beside the werewolves and the swan maidens as much as beside the gallows, and files in that drawer never close. And then the back. Of all the surfaces a punishment could claim, this one chose the only one you will never see. The blind side of your own body, the stretch of yourself you cannot watch or shield and have to trust the world with every time you turn around. People instinctively hate having their back exposed. Soldiers, and for that matter mob bosses, organize whole lives around sitting against walls. The blood eagle is that instinct's worst-case scenario, made real and given a name, and I'd guess a share of the shiver it still produces in a warm, safe room a millennium later comes from a spot between your shoulder blades that knows, right now, that you can't see it. The thinness of the sources, strangely, works for the legend rather than against it. 8 words, one sentence in a saga, a clause in Saxo, an ambiguous stone, a fully documented punishment, with statutes and eyewitness depositions, and, as with poor Fu Julie photographs, arrives finished, and a mind given no work to do doesn't linger. The eagle arrives as an outline, and every era that has received it, the saga compilers, Saxo with his salt, the Victorians with their saline stimulant, the showrunners with their silent enduring jarl, has been unable to resist finishing the drawing. An unfinished horror works on the mind like an open invitation, and the blood eagle may be the most accepted invitation in the history of violence, a collaboration 11 centuries long. Whatever happened or didn't happen at York in March of 867, that collaboration is real, is documented at every stage, and is, when you stand back from it, the actual subject of this video, the artifact we can genuinely hold. Not a rite, perhaps, but a rite-shaped space in human memory that 100 generations have taken turns carving. And one detail should rattle you a little. The whole thing, every text we've spent tonight with, came within a whisker of not existing at all. Nearly all of it funnels through a handful of physical books, actual objects of calfskin and ink, whose survival stories are their own small thrillers. The poetic Edda, our only source for Regnsmal and the smith's gloating stanza over Lyngvi, survives substantially in one manuscript. One, the Codex Regius, copied in Iceland in the 1270s. Which then drops out of sight for close to 400 years, its whereabouts across the entire late Middle Ages are blank, until a 17th century bishop somehow had it, and in 1662 it was shipped to the king in Copenhagen, one small book crossing the North Atlantic in a wooden vessel, a voyage that sank plenty of ships and their cargoes. Had that one crossing gone wrong, the Lyngvi stanza, and half of everything anyone knows about Norse mythology, goes to the bottom with it. The tale of Ragnar's sons, our fullest account of Aella's death, sits in Hauksbok, a compilation copied around 1310, much of it in the personal hand of an Icelandic lawman named Hauka, who simply liked collecting things worth knowing. Ormsthatter, with the giant Brucey and the salt, and Norna Guest's Thatter, and the complete Orkney saga with Halfdan's sacrifice, all come down inside Flati Jarbok, the largest and most beautiful of all Icelandic manuscripts. 2 priests work across years in the 1380s, and again the copies are nearly alone. Strip away a couple of physical books, and Torf-Einarr's eagle vanishes from the record like breath off glass. Then, in 1728, the city of Copenhagen caught fire and burned for days, and the blaze reached the university quarter where the great Icelandic collections were housed, and men ran manuscripts out of the buildings in armloads while the roofs came down. Much was lost. History we will simply never have. The eagle texts made it out. So when you weigh, as I've asked you to all night, how much trust the sources deserve, add this to the scales in whichever pan you think it belongs. The tradition we're arguing over amounts to a few armloads of books carried out of a burning city, the near-random remnant of a remnant, and the honest amount of confidence anyone gets to have about the 9th century has to pass through that bottleneck first. Modern York, if you go there, keeps its Viking layer close to the surface, and walking it puts a strange charge on everything we've covered. In the late 1970s, excavations at a site called Coppergate went 5 meters down through wet, airless soil that preserves what dry ground eats, and out of it came the Viking city itself, Jorvik, the actual streets Ivar's veterans settled, timber house walls still standing waist-high, workshops with the wood shavings still on the floors, leather shoes shaped by dead men's feet, a complete iron-banded helmet, combs, cups, dice, and the famous, less glamorous finds the tour guides love, including fossilized human waste the size of your forearm that tells us exactly how wormy a 9th century gut was. Today, a museum ride carries tourists through a reconstruction of it, animatronic Norse traders calling out over the smell machines, a family attraction built directly on top of the ground where, if the sagas tell it straight, a king of Northumbria was carved open in front of his own people one March morning. The city remembers the date in its way. Aella and Osbert both appear in later church calendars of the north, remembered together on the 21st of March, the day the kingdom of Northumbria functionally ended, and depending on which tradition you trust, either 2 kings fell in the wreck of a street battle, swords in hand, granted at least that much, or one of them was kept back from the mercy of the fighting for something the poets would still be sharpening 1,000 years later. Both versions fit in the same city on the same day, under the same museum. Choosing between them is the whole game, and York, to its credit, doesn't choose for you. We began the night with 8 words in a warm hall, and the hall itself may be the strangest feature of the oldest evidence, and hardly anyone ever mentions it. Sighvatur Thordarson was an Icelander, the most celebrated court poet of his generation, chief skald and close friend to King Olaf of Norway, the man the church would soon make Saint Olaf. And Sighvatur was himself a baptized Christian, a pilgrim to Rome no less. The Knutsdrapa, the praise poem our stanza opens, he composed for Knut the Great, the Danish king who conquered England in 1016 and ruled it for 20 years as a Christian monarch of ostentatious piety, a builder of churches, another Rome pilgrim, a man who wrote open letters to his English subjects about good Christian governance. That is the audience for the first recorded mention of the blood eagle, a Christian poet praising a Christian king in a court thick with bishops. And the stanza's job inside the poem is flattery by ancestry. Before counting Knut's own conquests, Sighvatur summons the last Danes who took England, the sons of Ragnar, and what Ivar did to Aella at York stands first in the whole catalogue, the founding precedent, cited as a lawyer cites a controlling case. Whatever the line describes, carved right or feeding bird, the poet deployed it as glory, in 8 polished syllables of a brand new metre, to an audience of the baptized, a century and a half after the fact, and nobody present, as far as the record shows, found that odd. Conquest was conquest. The eagle, bird or blade was simply what it looked like when Danes won, and a king who had just won the same island would be pleased by the rhyme of it. The most disputed sentence in Viking studies began life as a compliment. That comfort with atrocity as ornament runs all through the poetry these courts consumed, and knowing the idiom changes how the eagle sounds in your ear. Skalds praising a war king had a whole pantry of stock phrases built on carrion. A good commander gladdens the eagle, reddens the raven's claw, thins the wolf's hunger, gives the she-wolf breakfast. Battle itself hides inside kennings like the eagle's meal. Warriors are feeders of ravens, corpses are the wolf's portion. A generous king is generous above all to scavengers. Hundreds of verses survive in this register, delivered to the very men being praised, and the praised men paid for more. The imagery worked precisely as our stanza works, gruesome and admiring in the same breath. So when defenders of the carrion interpretation say Sigvartur's eagle belongs to that pantry, they are pointing at a real crowded shelf. And when defenders of the right answer that a poet in that world could just as easily compress a real ritual into the same 8 syllables, trusting listeners to know it, they are pointing at the same shelf from the other side. The idiom that makes the line explicable also makes it undecidable, and I've come to think that's the most Norse thing about the entire problem, a boast engineered, like their best ring forts, to be unbreakable from any direction. It's fair to ask, after all this source criticism, whether the Vikings' monstrous reputation was mostly built for them by the monks they robbed. And the honest answer is some of it, certainly. Our oldest image of the whole age comes from the sack of Lindisfarne in June of 793, the holy island off the Northumbrian coast, the same doomed kingdom where raiders out of the sea killed monks at the altar, drowned some in the surf, hauled others off in chains, and stripped the shrine of Cuthbert and the scholar Alcuin, writing his anguished letters about pagans desecrating the sanctuaries of God, set the tone for 3 centuries of clerical reporting in which every Northman was a devil by default. Victims write vivid history, and discounting for grief and rhetoric is fair. But the discounting only goes so far. The durable accusations rest on things that left marks, the slave chains in the ground, the hacked skeletons at execution sites, the annals, kept in different countries in different languages, that agree about the burned towns and the tribute measured in thousands of pounds of silver, the mound at Repton stacked with dead. The men who took York were, by the plainest material evidence, entirely capable of everything the sagas dressed them in. Capability isn't proof, and the gap between could have and did stays exactly as wide as it's been all night. But whenever you feel the pull of dismissing the eagle as pure slander of the innocent dead, remember that the innocent dead in this story are the ones Ivar's ships carried to the Dublin markets, and let the pull do with that what it will. The islands, then. Before the last stop, one Orkney story more, one that bears directly on how much weight a saga death scene can hold, and it involves the descendants of the very man who carved Halfdan open. Torf-Einarr's line ruled Orkney for centuries, and around 1117, 2 of his descendants, the cousins Magnus and Hakon, shared the earldom badly. A peace meeting was arranged on the little island of Egilsay, each side to bring 2 ships. Magnus came with 2. Hakon came with 8, and everyone present understood what that meant. Magnus spent the night in the church, singing, and in the morning offered his cousin every alternative he could think of: exile, a pilgrimage, imprisonment for life. Anything short of killing, and Hakon's chieftains refused them all, wanting 1 earl fewer by nightfall. Hakon ordered his standard-bearer to do it, and the man refused, angrily, to his earl's face. So the job fell down the household to the cook, a man named Leifolf, who began to weep, and Magnus, by every account the calmest person on the island, comforted his own executioner, told him the killing was not his sin, gave him his fine clothes, and made one request: not the neck. He asked to be struck hard on the head, standing rather than beheaded like a thief, so that he would meet death facing it. The axe came down as he asked. Now run the tape forward 800 years. Magnus was sainted. A red sandstone cathedral rose over his bones in Kirkwall. And in March of 1919, during restoration work, masons opened a cavity in one of the choir pillars and found a wooden box, and in the box a man's bones, and in the skull a great cleft, the unmistakable wound of a heavy blade driven into the head, exactly where the saga, written a century after the killing, said the blow had landed. One documented case, then, in which an Orkney saga described a famous execution in physical detail, and the bones, when they finally surfaced, agreed to the inch. It settles nothing about Halfdan, of course. A tradition can carry one death faithfully and embroider another. But anyone who tells you saga death scenes are only ever literature has to walk past that pillar to say it. And anyone who tells you they're all reliable has to walk past everything else we've covered tonight. The cathedral, incidentally, still holds the box. You can stand a few feet from the skull of a man whose last recorded act was consoling his killer, inside a building named for him, raised by the family that made him a corpse. And so, at last, to North Ronaldsay, to end where the best documented eagle spread its wings. North Ronaldsay is about as far as Britain goes, the last of the Orkneys. 4 miles of green shelf so flat the sea seems to stand above it on every side. Home now to around 50 people, 1 road, 1 shop, and the tallest land-based lighthouse in the British Isles, whose keepers once made up a meaningful share of the population. The island's modern fame belongs to its sheep, a native breed sealed off from the fields by a dry stone wall the islanders built right around the whole shoreline in 1832, 13 miles of it, so that the animals live their entire lives on the beach and have evolved to eat almost nothing but seaweed, one of the only mammals on Earth to manage it. Crofters still gather them off the rocks communally, the way their people have gathered things off those rocks for 5,000 years, past standing stones and an Iron Age broch and burial mounds nobody has fully counted. Somewhere in that turf, if the Orkney saga carries a true story, the mound of Halfdan Longleg has been sitting since around 893. Unmarked and unidentified, a prince of Norway folded open and offered to Odin, packed under the same grass the sheep ignore on their way down to the tide line. No excavation has ever gone looking for him. Perhaps none ever should. As long as no spade goes in, the island holds the whole question of tonight in perfect suspension, a grave that would settle everything, or nothing there at all, under 4 miles of grass at the edge of the map. The ferry calls a couple of times a week in summer. Gulls work the wall. The light turns on the tower at dusk the way it has since 1854, sweeping the beach, the dike, the mounds, and whatever the mounds do or don't contain, and then goes around, and comes back, and goes around. All right, that's where I'll leave it. A lighthouse beam passing over an unopened mound. Thank you for spending a couple of hours in the 9th century with me. If you want to keep this channel digging through the worst nights in human history, the Patreon and the YouTube memberships are what make the research time possible. All the links are down in the description and in the pinned comment. New episodes soon. Until then, sit facing the door and mind your back.